I'm Valerie. I am one of the Ladies of Comicazi and organizers of LadiesCon, and I am thrilled to be the moderator for this chat. This is like one of my dream panels, so let's get to it because we have a pretty limited amount of time. I'm going to actually let our panelists sort of do a quick introduction of themselves so we can hear a little bit about their work and what they do. So we're going to start. We're going to literally go in the order I see them in screen. So Mildred, I'm going to have you go first.
Hey everyone, I'm Mildred Louie. I'm the creator of the webcomic series Agents of the Realm, and I also run Asterius Nexus Studio, which is a nice little small creative studio that I've made and set up for myself to share my personal work and to also give a little home for some of my friends and some people I admire.
Awesome. And then Steph?
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm a freelance illustrator and comic artist. I have a book coming out through Oni Press next year that's going to be announced really soon, so keep an eye out for it.
Am I next? Yep. Hey everyone. I'm Kristen. I'm a comic book writer and artist. I made the graphic novel Hench Girl and Making Friends also, and both of them randomly have magical girls as like a big part of the subplot because it just comes out every time I write. I could try to write like a small scale like Manchester by the Sea family tragedy and someone would like find a magical locket at some point and get superpowers. It's in my brain, so I'm very glad to be here.
Awesome. I'm just going to get started then. Let's dive right into it. Here's what I want to start with talking about is I want to hear about each of your introduction to sort of the genre of magical girls. So like, what was your first like big, it doesn't have to be the first one you saw, but maybe the first one that really resonated with you, and what was it about it? Like, why did it resonate with you? And whoever wants to go first, go ahead. This is very conversational.
Are we all going to say Sailor Moon in unison? It was totally Sailor Moon for me, and that opened the floodgates. It's such a great show, and like as a kid, as like a little girl watching it, it's like this perfect mix of like wish fulfillment and also just seeing like Usagi is such a mess that I was like, oh great, it's a person who's like me. She's like bad at school and is like does dumb things all the time. So that was huge for me. And also like I watched like Card Captor Sakura, and there was something called Wedding Peach.
Yes, Wedding Peach.
Oh, wow.
Like the one person who knows
yes,
Wedding Peach.
I love Wedding Peach.
Yeah.
I randomly had a CD-ROM in the late 90s that had one like very pixelated episode of Wedding Peach on it, and I would just watch it over and over again. So that was a huge one for me too.
Yeah, I think literally my first magical girl anime was of course Sailor Moon. I saw it, it blew my mind. But my first manga ever was Sailor Moon, and it was the one where Chibiusa turns into Dark Lady, and I was obsessed with Dark Lady. I was like, oh my god! Like, I just thought she was so cool, and like anything with like her from then on, I was obsessed. But the other manga I bought after that was Tokyo Mew Mew. That was one of my earlier ones too.
Yeah, the first one was definitely Sailor Moon for me, but I think the one that left like the biggest impact was Magic Knight Rayearth, and that was just because like I remember I have like two older brothers growing up, so I watched a lot of like shonen stuff, and they had like all these cool animes with like giant robots and everything, and I was like, why don't I have that? Why isn't there something like that for me? And then I found Magic Knight Rayearth, and I just kind of lost my shit because I was just like, they're magical girls, and they have giant robots, and they have swords and all these cool weapons. This is so awesome.
So like, let's see. What is it specifically about the magical girl genre? Like, why is it that we're all here like talking about it? And like, why do you think it's been such a popular genre for the amount of time that it's been? Because they're still cranking those things out, right?
I think for a lot of people, like especially for me, it's just when like I got into it as a kid, a lot of my friends who are also into it got into it as a kid, and I think it's just a matter of seeing someone like you, seeing a girl, you know, being both realistic and like klutzy and like, oh, I like, you know, falling in love and, you know, school stuff, but then it's it shows that they can also be something more. It's really fun. It's like action, but also super feminine. And I think it's really cool being able, especially as a young kid, a young girl, being able to see yourself. Because I mean, outside of that, it was like there's a lot of like, oh, there's like Justice League and stuff like that, which is very cool. But like, I just never was drawn to that as a kid.
I wonder if what makes it so great, on top of what you just said, which is totally, it's kind of what like makes like Spider-Man like the best superhero, because you're like, oh yeah, but he also has like real life problems that are like important to his story. But I also think like the transformation aspect is what makes it so exciting, like, because it's the idea that you could be you, but like a different version of you who has superpowers and like a cool outfit. Like for me, like the concept of like being like, ha, and like suddenly I'm like well kempt and like wearing like an awesome outfit, like that's like a great fantasy. But also it's like that it's like very team based usually, so like there's like a fantasy of just like having like a core group of friends who also has like superpowers. There's so much to love about it.
Yeah, I know for me personally, like the thing that drew me to it the most was just like how focused on like self-exploration it is too. Like part of these characters' journeys is like they have to also learn to grow into like that power and that responsibility and like understanding what that means for them and like who they are in that aspect. And also just learning to like embrace that, like, you know, with Usagi, her power is like crying, like that's such a huge part of her. And it was something that like, you know, it's not really something that you would think as empowering, but to be able to see that in that kind of light that it could be was just really cool to me.
Definitely.
So now that we're older and are sort of creating things of our own, I wanted to talk about like how does Magical Girls influence your work? And for most of you, it's pretty apparent. But I guess my question is why? Like why and how? What aspects are you really trying to sort of dig into when you're referencing either just a reference or specifically writing magical girl stories?
I need to think about this for a second.
Yeah.
Why?
Like, yeah, I know for me, like with Agents of the Realm, like it's very unapologetically a magical girl story. But it's also been an interesting experience as I've developed and worked on it, because it's evolved a lot from where it first started. And it's also helped me kind of get a better idea of like what it is I actually like about that genre as a whole. And it definitely is rooted in that like sense of growth opportunity and like that not being something to shy away from. Like growing into your own sense of power and being is going to be super awkward and messy, and it's not going to necessarily be pretty, and you're going to make mistakes along the way, but that's also part of what makes it beautiful. And I remember that specifically from Sailor Moon 2, where it's like, you know, they could be these messy kids, but at the end of the day, that's also part of what makes that experience so empowering. It's because like they are kids and they're learning who they are, and in order for them to grow up, they need to be willing to make those mistakes and be messy and sloppy. So it's been fun to do that from like a college perspective. And I know for probably the first 2 volumes, I've been kind of like shy about going in on like the messiness of being in college. But I think at least now from where I am, I'm like, I'm really looking forward to exploring that further, because I feel like people don't really talk about that about college age. It's like, oh yeah, most freedom, but it's like no one talks about how terrifying that actually is. It's like the first time you're on your own and you're expected to be an adult and make these life-altering decisions, and that's not fun.
Yeah, and I think especially kind of like I like seeing what's been happening with the magical girl genre in the past like 10, 20 years or so, where you're starting to see people deconstruct it a lot and reinterpret in different ways, both on like in like indie comics, you know, mainstream things, and even stuff like Madoka Magica. When I saw that, I was like, oh my gosh, this is changing the game. I didn't think like, because to me originally when I was younger, I was like, oh, with magical girl stories, it's the most formulaic thing you can get. You know, you find your power, you get your power, you fight, you fall in love at the end. But then you see things like Madoka Magica, or even something like Zodiac Star Force or something, where you're seeing people reinterpret it. And I think that's so exciting, because you're seeing a lot of people take that influence and make something completely different out of it. I worked on an indie graphic novel for a year or so that was magical girl, but yet again, it was very deconstructive. It wasn't, you know, just about fighting. It was actually more about like the interpersonal dynamics and stuff like that. I think it's a really great jumping off point, because it influenced so many people. But now that it's in the hands of like a whole new generation, it's going all over the place. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I'd say, first of all, I totally agree. Madoka Magica was a show that it blew my mind so hard that like I'm still like reverberating. It's been so many years.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second to sort of, for people who aren't familiar with it, because it really broke the mold like for magical girls. So if anybody wants to also just sort of talk about like how it's different. So
yeah, it's
yeah,
like
I'll let you go ahead, because
it's interesting because it kind of takes what Mildred was saying about like the emotions being the strength of the magical girl, and like it actually works that into the lore where it's almost, well, I don't want to smile.
No, I think with Madoka Magica, kind of like the big concept of it is like when you look at the art style, it's very sugary sweet. It's very cute. It's what you'd expect from a magical girl series. But there comes a point in it when the big kind of message of the show is like, be careful what you wish for, like kind of the Uncle Ben thing of like, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. Yeah. And it's in the hands of like 14-year-olds. And this is very common in anime. They're like, let the 14-year-old save the world. But, you know, it takes it a very logical approach of like, oh no, that's a terrible idea. And there's going to be big consequences.
Yeah, it's such a good show. It's like really, it can get really upsetting. And I think that's part of it, is that it kind of takes the sort of dressings of magical girl stuff and like follows it through to like devastating conclusions of like how wrong things can go. And, you know, when someone's a child, it's like, there still can be, you know, confronted with having like adult responsibilities. And that's kind of, yeah.
It's really good. Watch it.
I want to talk a little bit too about like your specific work and sort of how you bring the magical girl genre into your writing. Like, let's talk a little bit about like making friends.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I mean, in Hench Girl, there's a magical girl because I was like, I love magical girls. And then in Making Friends, I was like, it's about a girl who's in 7th grade. And I was like, what was I like in 7th grade? And I was like, oh, I was just literally only talking about Sailor Moon all day long. And I had like 2 friends and we all picked Sailor Scouts. And I was like, I'll be Sailor V because I like her glasses and she's famous. And my other friend, Jono, was like, I'm Sailor Mars because I'm like cool and stuff. And then my other friend, Ashley, was like, I'm Sailor Jupiter. And so we would like call each other that instead of our names and like play in the back of the classroom and stuff. So like that was like my childhood, was like pretending to be Sailor Moon and stuff, like way after I was, you know, when I was like 13 or 14. So a little bit of a late bloomer, but it was such a huge part of like my life that like I couldn't even fathom writing about 7th grade without magical girl stuff. And also because 7th grade is also like a really tough year in terms of like fitting in and stuff. That like when I was in 7th grade, I kind of retreated in a little bit to like my imagination because those 2 friends I mentioned were not in any of my classes, and I was suddenly around all these random strangers, none of whom were cool enough to even know what Sailor Moon was. So like in a way, for me, I kind of used it as showing like her coping mechanism of escaping from reality.
I think that's so true, right? Because you've all sort of already talked about this a little bit, is that like when we're talking about magical girls, it works 2 ways, right? It's both a wish fulfillment / fantasy, but as time goes by, we're realizing that, you know, at the same time, we're still human, and that human aspect continues to come out. I want to talk more about sort of how the genres evolved over time, and sort of what we're seeing now. So like when we think about like the early 90s, oh my gosh, as someone who was like around for that, I'm like, oh my God. With Sailor Moon versus the stuff that we're seeing come out now. Madoka was a good example. Like what other different kinds of magical girl stories are we seeing? Is there anything recently that's like sort of resonated or you've noticed? Is there any, or even if there's like a different kind of story that
I feel like I'm seeing a lot more, as opposed to like just solely magical girl series, in like Western cartoons, like Steven Universe, Bee and Puppycat, stuff like that, where you can see it like really like kind of making its way in, where there's like transformation scenes and there's like parodies of kind of, I think Adventure Time has like some kind of like, you know, like Tuxedo Mask Sailor Moon kind of references in it, stuff like that, where even if it's not like a main series coming out of Japan or something, I feel we're seeing it a lot more. It's becoming more of like an accepted like trope here. Like people just casually talk about it because like when we were kids, like, you know, there's only like a few kids would know, the kids who would watch like Toonami after school kind of a thing, but otherwise, you know, it was kind of like, wait, what is this? But now I feel it's very common, and it's kind of like bled its way into like Western culture too.
I think the most recent magical girl series I actually watched is Lolly Rock. I think it's actually a French, originally made by a French studio. But yeah, that was like the first magical girl series in a while that I had seen that was like very strictly magical girls that like really captured my attention, because it just seemed to put a focus on like honoring magical girls as a genre in a way that was so sincere and like heartfelt, where it was like, yeah, it's like about these teenagers and they're kind of obnoxious. Like the main girl is super obnoxiously bubbly, and like me in my like 30s, I'm like, God, to be that young again. Like, but it's also like it still went through the steps of like going through like the heavier arcs, similar to like what Sailor Moon had, where they're suffering and like they're not necessarily suffering. I guess I shouldn't say that. It's more like they're struggling and understanding like what it means to be different. Because I don't want to spoil like the storyline, but it's literally like the main character finds out that she's not from Earth, similar to Usagi, and her trying to explore and discover like her roots and her family was just so wonderful. And like that was the kind of thing that I also remember loving so much about Sailor Moon, was just these girls knowing that they're not from here, and that push and pull between their sense of humanity as like human beings and also like these other earthly beings who are from someplace else, who have like a history that they're kind of beholden to. So I loved that a lot, to see that again.
I don't think I've seen that one. Do you guys have any other recommendations for shows that we should be, for those of us who are enthusiasts?
Nothing
Earth
that
was
springs.
a good one.
I'm trying to think, because I did just rewatch Sailor Moon. Like, well, I'm not done, but I'm like 200 something episodes in. So I know, and I was like, wow, oh my God, I totally get why young me was obsessed with this, because it was like a cartoon that like took kids seriously, you know? It wasn't like, and here's the lessons, children. It was like, it was more like adult sort of style storytelling, but for kids. And that's kind of what I liked about it. But I think Steven Universe is a really good example too, because there's like, it's so beholden to Sailor Moon.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how the magical girl genre has worked its way into our like narrative for storytelling.
Yeah.
Right? And why do you? I'm going to actually do a quick little aside. If anyone in the audience has questions, please feel free to just pop them into the chat. There's someone actually named questions here. We're going to open up for questions in a little bit. But my other question was, right, other than Steven Universe, like, where else have we seen this sort of pop up, right? And why do we think we're seeing it pop up?
There's some, like, DC thing called, like, Amethyst, and I remember seeing some short of it. And it was, like, very cute. I don't really know much about it, but I was like, oh my god, that's so great that they're making like a magical girl like in the DC universe.
Yeah.
I didn't even know about her. So there's a magical girl now in the DC universe. I suppose there's always been magical girls in some way, right? It's just sort of this different one that we're talking about that comes from anime and manga. Let's see. So as the genre has evolved, and so we already talked about sort of the changes that we've noticed. What additional changes would we like to see? Like, where's the genre still kind of letting us down a little bit?
Age. It'd be nice to see like more older magical girls. Like, I haven't personally seen Madoka, but like everything I've heard was, I guess, kind of like at its core the issue that I personally have with the genre, where it's like so focused on putting this power in like 14-year-olds and like these kids who haven't really experienced life yet. But it'd be so nice to see more magical girl stories where they're just older, like just later in life. Maybe either they have been magical girls for ages and, you know, they're trying to figure out what it's like to be a parent and a magical girl, and like those kinds of different aspects of being, just because so much of it does seem to be rooted in like coming of age, but like, I don't know, I feel like you never really stop growing up. You never really stop like exploring who you are.
Yeah. And
like,
we're like
you have
still
so many
relating to it.
Yeah, like you're always getting older and you're always going through all these new experiences where you have to discover who you are in relationship to it. So it would just be so nice to see more of that, just like as you get older, because like all these kids who grew up on Sailor Moon, we're all growing up. It'd be nice to see more of it like grow up with us too.
Magical woman.
Yeah.
A whole new genre. Stephanie and Kristen, is there anything else that you'd like to see explored more in the genre?
I feel like Sailor Moon had a good start with playing with gender a little more, especially when it's like such a gendered concept as magical girls. But we had like the Sailor Starlights, or we have like Haruka, who's kind of more just like ambiguous in their not ambiguous, but you know, more like a little bit more gender fluid in the way they present. And I think it would be cool to see more. And I think from like when I look through like Twitter and I look through people's like art, like a lot of people are drawing like, you know, people like non-binary or different, you know, representations of people around the world. And I feel like people want that. People want to see themselves in this genre, because while it is like very ingrained in like being a girl and that, but like that can mean so many different things, and there's a lot of ways to interpret that. So I think that would be really cool.
Yeah, I just have to second that. Just different types of people. I mean, it's the kind of format that almost anyone can be like, what if one day a talking animal came up to me and said I was the chosen one? What would I do? Like, everyone would have a different response to that. Every one of those responses is a different story. And like, it's such a great kind of like setup for a story that's kind of like, the hello world, try this format on for size, because we could use more of these kinds of stories. But it's interesting because in Madoka, like part of why it's these kids is because like if they're like, oh, like because when you're a teenager, your hormones make you big, your emotions are so strong that it's like a magical power, which I thought was really cool, because it's like true when you're going through puberty, you're just like like everything sets you off and everything is life or death. So like to sort of like represent that with a magical girl concept is great. But yeah, it's not like you stop growing after you turn like, you know, 20 or whatever.
I like the idea of the older ones, like almost like a Golden Girls gone like magical girl.
My dream. My absolute dream.
Anyway, we are starting to get some questions from the audience. And the first question is there a magical girl trope that has been, is it trope or trope?
Trope?
Maybe they mean trope, that has been played out that you want to see evolve with time?
I think for me, maybe I love romance and dumb romantic side plots, but I feel like a lot of the time in magical girl series, you kind of get your like tuxedo mask who they kind of like walk in there like, Sailor Moon, you can do it. And she's like, oh yeah, sure. And so I think maybe like fleshing that out more. I feel like just like the guy kind of coming in and being like, you got this, and then them suddenly being fine is a little a little
Yeah.
played out. I mean, you don't see it as much anymore. I think that's very, like, in Tokyo Mew Mew and Wedding Peach was very, like, she was, like, hopeless without, like, the guy being like, Momo, I love you, or whatever. But I think it'd be cool, like, I'm like, yes, keep the romance in, but, like, commit to it. Like, I don't want Tuxedo Mask just coming in, giving his one-liner. That's not enough.
Yeah, especially when their relationship, like, was kind of toxic. Like, so I guess, like, to piggyback off of that, like, yeah, I'd love to see, like, more romance, but just healthier romance, or, like, just giving you more options for what the romance can be like, instead of it being this weird do or die thing, which I understand, like, when you're 14 and you find someone you like, that's kind of what it feels like. It's like, I can't live without them. But, like, it'd be nice to see more of it being, like, I don't know, like, friends to lovers, or, like, even enemies to lovers. Like, that would be cool. Like, just more variety would be really nice to see.
I'd say for me, I love all the tropes of magical girl stuff, because at this point it just gives me nostalgia. I'm like, yay, smash that nostalgia button. But in general, I think that a trope that I'm not crazy about is when everything is the end of the world. I like smaller stakes. If you give it smaller stakes, it weirdly, paradoxically, I at least become much more invested, because I'm like, oh, I relate to these stakes. I don't relate to the stakes of, like, the whole world being in jeopardy, but I do relate to, like, interpersonal things. So I guess, like, I would love it if there were more stories that were, like, smaller, but still with the flourishes of magical girl stuff. But I guess that's, like, literally what I did with some of my stuff. So I guess I'm doing that. So whatever.
All right. Our next question is, it says, one of the themes in Steven Universe was about the consequences of your actions and PTSD left behind after those big battle scenes. Do you think that shows have a responsibility to consider that aspect?
100%. 100%. I think, especially something with magical girls, and you see a lot of stuff, kind of like we were saying with, like, Darian and Serena's relationship, stuff like that, or just, like, in Madoka's, like, all PTSD, and they delve into that in, like, a very chaotic way. But I like that they approached it, whereas, like, you've seen a lot of earlier series, they're just kind of like, you have the weight of the world on your shoulders, but, like, you can kind of magic it away and then you're fine, like, or, like, it's your destiny to solve it, so you know you're going to be fine. But I especially think for a genre that very much caters to people, you know, in their teens or preteens, kind of, like, going through a lot of changes, where it's like you don't have the answers just given to you magically. It is nice when series kind of address, like, tougher things, especially when it comes to responsibility or, like, even death, because, like, there's a lot of death in these series, but I think it's just like, oh no, it's fine. It's magic. It's fine. Not to say that everything has to have, like, the most, like, serious ending or tone ever. Everything doesn't have to be Madoka. But I think there's certain times where it's good to address kind of the elephant in the room.
Mm-hmm. I think every story has to kind of deal with the consequences of the character's actions. Otherwise, you have to wonder why you had the character do the thing, unless the point of it is that the character avoids taking consequences. But, like, that can also be interesting. With my book Making Friends, is kind of like, it was the arc of Danny's character is, like, she's, like, just, like, goofing off and, like, brings an evil prince from Solar Sisters, wink wink, to life, and, like, also a magical girl best friend. And then she's like, oh God, what did I do? I just, like, made my life so complicated. And I feel like that's part of what is, like, cool about magical girl stuff, is that it has, like, the blend of, like, your fantasy world and, like, just, like, reality setting in. But yeah, I agree. I think that that's super important.
I personally, I would say no. I don't think it's necessary, but I think that's mostly because it depends on entirely, like, what that show is supposed to be, or, like, what that story is supposed to be. Like, if it's supposed to be something that's, like, totally self-indulgent and you're just, like, going for the ride, then like, yeah, I'm not gonna go into it expecting, you know, it's the topic to, or like the story to like explore all these like really deep topics. But I will say that I really do appreciate how, like, as like our generation gets older and like we're the ones who are telling stories, like since we did grow up in the world where we were kind of deceived in terms of like our expectations, because yeah, we did grow up where like everything was like just smile and it'll be okay, and we're taking the time to explore these deeper themes. I think that's really cool. But yeah, I guess like sometimes I just like watching things that there's no real consequences, there's no real stakes, it's just people doing buffoonery, and that's okay.
Yeah, especially if like you wouldn't want to watch like Wedding Peach and be like, I need them to really feel the consequences and think about marriage as a union and are they doing it for tax benefits? Like, no, you just be like, no, it's cute. Wedding's a cute thing, so
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to branch off on that question a little bit and ask you guys. So we're talking about, you know, is it the responsibility to show like, you know, the consequences of your actions? My question is as society changes, and since the magical girl genre is often targeted towards a younger, more impressionable audience, do you think that there's a responsibility for the writers and those who are working within this genre to more accurately reflect the world as it is? And like
in terms
people
of, like,
as they are, and how they, you know, like how they look, how they are, like what's going on with the world.
well, I especially think with everything that's happening now, I feel a lot of media is going to change in very big ways, like dealing with like pandemic and stuff. Not saying that yet again, kind of like what we were saying for the last question, like it doesn't have to. Sometimes it's nice to have like the escapism of like they're just on their own planet, they're hanging out, whatever, it's fine. But I think no matter what, like I always feel like the current day events always inform the work, even if you don't think of it in the moment. You can look back at stuff from the 90s and see like certain things, like, you know, the current events, like the threat of like technology or like the internet kind of like informing a lot of like fears, or enemies will kind of be like, I'm using the internet to be weird. And that's like, it's because there's like a fear of the unknown with that. So I feel like even if people aren't like consciously doing it in the moment, I feel like it'll reflect either way.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like for me personally that it's like a complicated question, because I feel like oftentimes the responsibility of like reflecting the world as it is usually falls on the people who aren't as widely represented. So it's like the responsibility suddenly becomes a lot bigger, where like if we don't take the decision to reflect it as it truly is, then we are automatically failing, when in reality it's like there should be room for people of all different identities and backgrounds and different representations to be able to just write the kind of stories that they want. But in that same line of breath, it's like, if you're like a mainstream network and you know you have the reach and the money, then you should probably be taking the steps to try just like a little bit harder, just like a tiny, tiny bit harder, just to make sure that you're not just creating this limited scope of what the world is and what the world is like. Like if you have that much power, then yeah, the responsibility is a bit on you to be smart about how you handle that power and reach.
Yeah, I think people who want to reflect the real world in their work should totally do that. But people who don't feel drawn to doing that and want to just do their own thing, like you shouldn't, like no one has to do anything in their stories. I mean, if the person wondering this question was like a creator, it's like you could just tell the story that you feel like telling. And because there is kind of an expectation, it usually based off of like, you know, part of your identity is like, oh, you have to then tell people like a message about what it's like being like this or that kind of person. It's like there's no obligation. You don't constrain yourself to that. Only write that if it comes out naturally, because if it doesn't come out naturally, it might not really, you know, it might be reflected in the actual thing that you were like shoehorning something in. But if it's something that like you're really inspired to say, you should do it. But like, I don't know. I was like, I don't want to put anything about Trump in my books. Like, like this is my place away from that. And in fact, actually, I wrote book 1 of Making Friends in the Obama day, and then like things changed like after I'd finished it, and I was like, oh man, this is such like, it's funny, like I could tell like it was like such an it was such an Obama era narrative, because she was like, who cares about the world, I'm just gonna do me. And now you almost feel like we have to care about the world because things are crazy, we have to like make sure we don't ruin the planet. So that was actually something that was like really, it was interesting for me to experience, because I was like, wow, if I had written this right now, this narrative would have been so extremely different. But you also can't, it takes so long for a book to come out, usually, like that by the time it's out, like the zeitgeist might have changed.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, I was thinking like, oh yeah, maybe I have this like story idea for something that's related to COVID. And then I was like, but by the time I do it, is everyone going to be like, oh my God, I'm done with COVID, just stop talking about it. So it's like, it's complicated.
That was a great answer to a really hard question. And I would argue, yeah, that I would feel that, especially with some of your works, you guys are reflecting, I think, the world a little bit better now than how it is. My problem when I was growing up, and it's not about me, but was that the Sailor Moon characters all had the same face.
Yeah.
My brother pointed that out to me, and that like ruined my day. I was like, what are you talking about?
Right.
I had like these Sailor Moon coloring pages, and I just started coloring their hair different colors, and I was like, oh my God.
But it's true, like their height, and their hair are the only things that really differentiate them.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna take this over, and this will probably be our last question. Because it's kind of a fun question, and because we brought it up, it says, can you please ask the panelists to cast a Golden Magical Girls series?
That's my dream question. I literally watch Golden Girls like every night. So we're casting the Golden Girls as Sailor Scouts?
Yeah,
like
however you want to answer that question. Like, even if you want to like pitch your pilot, go for it. Like.
This one's a hard one. Oh my gosh.
Hi.
I feel
Sailor
like
Jupiter is Dorothea.
no, Dorothy's Mars. Mars is like,
Oh,
she
you're
tells
right.
it like it is, but she's very fiery. Dorothy's very fiery. Rose is like the really sweet, like kind of doofy, ditzy one. So she's kind of like Sailor Moon. Yeah. Blanche is like sexy and very suave. I don't know. I feel like none of the Sailor Moon girls are like necessarily very like seductive. I don't know. Maybe like Neptune. I don't know.
I would say Sailor Venus, because she's more like self-assured, maybe.
Yeah.
And she's got a bow. The bow is really cool.
And then Sophia's like, she's the comedic one-liner. She has all like the snappy quips. I don't know, she can be like Artemis or something.
Oh, yeah. Now all I can do is picture Artemis like sitting, like holding a little purse.
A little wicker purse. Just Estelle Getty's voice in her face, but like on a cat body.
Amazing. And that's all the questions that we have. So unless you guys was there anything that we didn't cover that you were sort of dying to talk about and I didn't bring it up?
I love Sailor Moon.
Yeah.